The wind howled through the narrow alleyways as rain drizzled onto the quiet streets of a small town. Inside a cozy little cafe, the scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air. It was the kind of place where people gathered not just for a meal, but for a sense of community. And at the heart of it all was Henry Dawson, an elderly man with kind eyes, a steady hand, and a lifetime of stories hidden behind his wrinkled smile. Henry had run Dawson's Café for over 30 years. It wasn't just a business to him. It was his home, his pride, and a place where folks always found a warm meal and an even warmer welcome. Every morning, he wiped down the counters, brewed the first pot of coffee, and greeted his regulars like old friends. Some days were slow, some were busy, but through it all, he held on to the same belief: kindness always wins. But kindness wasn't what walked through his door that evening. The bell above the door jingled, and in stepped 3 men, young, rough-looking, with an air of arrogance that turned heads immediately. Their leader, a man covered in tattoos, with a smirk that never quite faded, strolled right up to Henry's counter, tapping on it with a heavy ring on his finger. "Nice place you got here, old man," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Be ashamed if something happened to it." Henry set down the rag he'd been using to wipe a table and studied the man carefully. He'd seen all kinds of people in his time, some good, some bad, and some who just didn't know any better. He chose his words carefully, keeping his voice steady. "We don't want any trouble here, son." The thug chuckled, exchanging glances with his crew. "Trouble? Nah, we're just here to do some business. You know, protection. This part of town's getting rough. Accidents happen. Windows break. Fires start. Wouldn't want that to happen to your little cafe, would you?" The air in the room turned heavy. A couple of customers lowered their heads, pretending not to listen, while others instinctively reached for their wallets, eager to finish their meals and leave. Henry, however, didn't flinch. He had seen his fair share of hard times, but he never let fear make his decisions for him. "I appreciate your concern," Henry said evenly, "but this cafe's done just fine without your protection." The leader's smirk faded. His fingers drummed against the counter, slow and deliberate. "That's so." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Think real hard, old man. We'll be back tomorrow. You'd be smart to have our money ready." With that, they turned and walked out, leaving behind a thick tension that lingered in the air long after the door swung shut. Henry exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He wasn't a man who gave in to intimidation, but he also knew that men like that didn't make empty threats. He'd seen enough in his years to recognize the kind of trouble that was coming. But what those punks didn't know was that Henry wasn't alone. As he locked up the cafe for the night, Henry reached for an old, worn-out phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in a long time. It rang only once before a deep voice answered on the other end. "Hey, old man," the voice said, full of warmth and familiarity. "Been a while." Henry sighed, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips, despite the weight in his chest. "I could use a little help, son." There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end hardened. "What's going on?" Henry hesitated for a moment before replying. "Some boys came by tonight. They're looking for trouble." A quiet breath. Then the voice answered, steady and sure. "We'll be there." The next evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the cafe's front door swung open again. But this time, it wasn't just Henry standing behind the counter. Sitting at a corner table, calmly sipping their coffee, were men who carried themselves differently. Their eyes were sharp, their movements controlled. They weren't rowdy, they weren't loud, but there was something unmistakable about them, an air of quiet confidence, the kind that only came from experience. The thug and his men strutted in, expecting the same fearful look from Henry. But something was different. The cafe wasn't empty, it wasn't quiet. And the moment the thug met the eyes of the men at the corner table, his smirk faltered for the first time. Because he knew these weren't just any men. They were Marines, and they were here for Henry. What happened next was something those thugs would never forget. The cafe was unusually quiet, the tension settling in like a thick fog. The leader of the thugs, the one with the smug grin and the heavy ring tapping against the counter, glanced around. His cocky confidence wavered just slightly as his eyes settled on the men sitting in the corner. They weren't doing anything, just drinking coffee, talking in low voices, completely at ease. But there was something about them, something he couldn't quite place, that made his gut twist. Henry, standing calmly behind the counter, watched as the thug's fingers twitched at his sides. The young man wasn't used to feeling uneasy. He was used to people cowering, hurrying to hand over whatever was asked of them. But now, for the first time in a long time, he hesitated. The leader forced a smirk, shoving his hands into his pockets to hide the tension creeping up his arms. "I see you got company tonight," he said, his voice lighter than before, but not as steady. "Hope we're not interrupting anything." Henry wiped his hands on a rag, moving slow, deliberate. "Not at all," he said, his tone unreadable. "Just serving coffee like always." One of the men in the corner, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with short cropped hair, turned his mug in his hands before taking a slow sip. His eyes flickered up to the thug for just a second, calm, unreadable, but sharp, the kind of look that saw everything. The leader chuckled, though it sounded forced. "Good," he said, turning his attention back to Henry, "because we got business to finish." Henry didn't respond right away. He took a step forward, resting his palms on the counter as he met the thug's gaze. "I told you yesterday," he said, voice steady. "I'm not interested in whatever it is you're selling." The cafe seemed to shrink around them, the air thick and charged. The thug licked his lips, shifting his weight. He could feel the eyes of the men at the table on him, could sense the way they were watching. Not aggressively, not threateningly, just aware. "See, here's the thing," the leader continued, forcing himself to sound amused. "I don't think you understand how this works. We ain't asking. This is how things go in this town now. You either pay up, or things get messy." He let the last word hang in the air, waiting for the usual reaction: fear, panic, the moment where Henry realized he was out of options. But it didn't come. Henry just stood there, unwavering. And worse than that, the men at the table didn't move. They didn't shift in their chairs, didn't even look particularly concerned. And that's when the leader's gut tightened again. Something wasn't right. The door to the cafe swung open suddenly, the bell jingling, and another man stepped inside. He was tall, with sharp eyes and a strong, steady presence. He walked with a quiet authority, like someone who'd spent years in command. He wasn't flashy, wasn't trying to look tough. He just was. And when he stopped beside Henry and folded his arms across his chest, the room seemed to get even smaller. "Everything okay here?" the man asked, his voice deep, calm. Henry nodded, but there was a hint of something in his expression, something close to relief. "Just a little business talk," he said, though his tone made it clear that he wasn't the one who had started it. The thug's jaw tightened. "And who the hell are you?" he asked, trying to regain control of the situation. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow glance around the cafe, his gaze passing over the group at the table before settling back on the thug. There was a pause, and then a small, knowing smile. "You don't want to do this," the man finally said, his tone firm but almost understanding. Like he'd seen this play out 100 times before, like he already knew how it was going to end. The leader scoffed, shaking off the unease creeping up his spine. "Oh yeah," he shot back, trying to laugh. "And why's that?" The man studied him for a moment before answering. "Because you're out of your depth." Something in the way he said it made the thug stiffen. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it felt like one, like a warning. He looked around again, at the quiet, watchful men in the corner. He didn't know who they were, but something in his gut told him they weren't the kind of people you wanted to mess with. His fingers twitched again at his sides, the weight of the ring on his hand suddenly feeling heavier than before. His pride screamed at him to push back, to show that he wasn't afraid. But his instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive this long, were telling him something else. A beat passed, then another. Finally, he exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing a smirk as he took a step back. "All right," he said, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "I see how it is. You got friends. Good for you." He turned on his heel, heading for the door with his crew following close behind. But just before stepping outside, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His smirk was still there, but his eyes were darker now. "This ain't over," he muttered, low enough that only Henry and the man beside him could hear. "You think you won something tonight? You just made things worse." Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, the bell jingling in the silence he left behind. The cafe stayed still for a moment. Then, slowly, the tension began to ease. Customers exhaled, shoulders relaxed. But Henry didn't move. He kept his eyes on the door, his jaw tight. The man beside him finally broke the silence. "You all right?" Henry nodded once, but there was something heavy in his gaze. "He'll be back," he murmured. The man didn't disagree. Instead, he looked toward the men at the table, who had been watching the whole thing unfold with quiet attentiveness. One of them, a wiry, sharp-eyed man with a hint of a scar across his cheek, set his empty mug down and stretched. "Well," he said casually, "guess we better stick around for a while." A low murmur of agreement passed through the group. They weren't loud, weren't boastful, but there was an unmistakable certainty in their voices. They had been in situations like this before. They knew what was coming. Henry looked at them, then at the man beside him. He let out a slow breath, nodding. "Guess so." Outside, down the street, the thug leader stalked toward his car, jaw clenched. He barely heard the voices of his crew, barely registered anything except for the pounding in his ears. He had never been pushed back like that before, never felt this kind of uncertainty. But one thing was for sure. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Night settled over the small town, wrapping the streets in silence. Inside Dawson's Café, the air was still thick with unspoken words. Henry moved slowly behind the counter, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, his mind somewhere else. He had seen his fair share of tough guys, men who strutted into places thinking they owned the world. But this was different. The leader of those thugs, there was something behind his eyes, something that said he wasn't going to just walk away. Henry had dealt with trouble before, but this time it wasn't just about him. It was about his cafe, his livelihood, and the people who came here every day feeling safe. He wasn't about to let anyone take that away. Across the room, the men who had silently backed him up were still at their table. They weren't in any rush to leave, and their presence was of quiet reassurance. The man who had stood beside Henry earlier, the one with the sharp eyes and steady presence, finally spoke. "You're thinking too much," he said, leaning back in his chair. Henry exhaled through his nose, setting his rag down. "Hard not to," he admitted. The man gave a small nod. "Figured they'd be back." Henry sighed. "Yeah, and something tells me they won't be coming just to talk." The others at the table exchanged glances, unreadable but knowing. They had seen this kind of situation before. Maybe not here, maybe not in a quiet cafe like this, but the pattern was always the same. Some men thought fear was the easiest currency to collect. They didn't expect to run into people who wouldn't buy in. The man sitting closest to the door, tall, with a quiet intensity that made him seem almost statuesque, set down his coffee cup and stretched. "So what do you want to do, Henry?" Henry ran a hand through his graying hair, considering. He had never been the kind of man to pick a fight, but he had also never been one to back down from what was right. "I just want to keep this place safe," he said finally. "For the people who come here. For myself. I don't want any trouble, but I won't let them push me around either." The tall man nodded, as if that was the answer he had expected. "Then we stay." Henry hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man to ask for help, even when he needed it. But these weren't just any men. They were Marines, men who had seen things, who understood what it meant to stand their ground. They weren't here for a fight, but if one came, they weren't the type to walk away. Before Henry could say anything more, the door creaked open, and a young man stepped inside. He was maybe in his early 20s, dressed in a worn hoodie and jeans, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot before spotting Henry behind the counter. Mr. Dawson," he said hesitantly. Henry frowned slightly, recognizing the kid from around town. His name was Ryan, one of those kids who had grown up rough, but never seemed like a bad one. Henry had seen him in the cafe a few times, always alone, always keeping to himself. "Yeah, Ryan," Henry said. "Something wrong?" Ryan hesitated, glancing toward the table where the Marine sat, watching him quietly. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. I just wanted to tell you to be careful." Henry narrowed his eyes slightly. "Why's that?" Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "That guy, Mason, the one who came in earlier, he's serious. He's not just some street punk looking for quick cash. He's got connections, real ones. If he says he's coming back, he means it." Henry studied the boy carefully. "How do you know him?" Ryan looked away, shoving his hands deeper into his hoodie pockets. "We used to run together. Not anymore." There was something heavy in those words. Henry didn't push. Instead, he nodded slowly. "And why are you telling me this?" Ryan hesitated before meeting Henry's gaze. "Because you're a good guy. And Mason, he doesn't like being made to look weak. If you don't give him what he wants, he'll find a way to take it." The words hung in the air. The men at the table said nothing, but they were listening, watching. Henry's fingers curled against the counter. "Well," he said after a moment, his voice calm, "I appreciate the warning, son, but I'm not giving him anything." Ryan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, figured you'd say that." He hesitated. "Look, I gotta go. Just watch your back, okay?" With that, he turned and hurried out the door, disappearing into the night. Henry stood there for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then slowly, he turned to the men at the table. The Marine with the sharp eyes, Jason, studied Henry for a long moment before speaking. "Mason, huh?" Henry nodded. "Looks like we've got a name." Jason glanced at the others, then back at Henry. "We should find out more about who we're dealing with." The others nodded in agreement. One of them, Danny, a wiry man with quick reflexes and a knack for reading people, pulled out his phone, already searching. "If this guy has real connections, we need to know how deep they go." Henry exhaled slowly, pressing his hands against the counter. He wasn't sure what kind of mess he had just stepped into, but one thing was clear: Mason wasn't going to back down, and now neither was he. Outside, down the darkened streets, Ryan walked quickly, his hands clenched into fists inside his hoodie. He had done what he could. He had warned Henry, but deep down he knew it wouldn't be enough. Mason wasn't the type to let things go. And somewhere in the shadows, a figure watched him go. A low chuckle echoed in the stillness of the night. "This is gonna be fun." The night air was thick with something unspoken, something heavy. Ryan pulled his hoodie tighter around himself as he walked, his mind racing. He knew Mason better than most people did, knew what he was capable of, and he had a bad feeling that tonight was only the beginning. Back at the cafe, the silence was different now. It wasn't just tension, it was preparation. Henry locked the front door and turned off the neon open sign, but no one inside was thinking about leaving. The men at the table, the ones who had been watching everything unfold, weren't just bystanders anymore. They had stepped into something, and they knew it. Jason leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee. "We need to assume Mason isn't coming back alone," he said finally, his voice even but firm. Danny, still scrolling through his phone, exhaled. "Looks like this guy's been involved in a lot of small-time operations, but recently he's been moving up. That means he's got people backing him, people who don't like looking weak." He glanced at Henry. "He's not going to let this go." Henry nodded, his jaw tight. He had figured as much. This wasn't just about his cafe anymore. Mason wanted to send a message. The men exchanged looks, silent understanding passing between them. They didn't need to say much. They had been through worse, seen worse. But something about this felt personal. Maybe it was the way Henry had stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. Maybe it was the quiet way the cafe felt like home, even to them. Whatever it was, they weren't walking away. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees along the empty streets. The town had long since gone to sleep, but in the distance, the sound of engines broke through the stillness. Low, steady, not in a hurry. Henry heard it first, his fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. He didn't have to look to know who it was. "They're here," Jason murmured, standing. The others followed, their movements calm, almost methodical. No panic, just quiet preparation. Danny moved to the back of the cafe, flipping off the remaining lights. Another Marine, a tall, broad man named Carter, locked the back entrance. They weren't setting up for a fight, but they weren't leaving anything to chance. Henry exhaled slowly, then moved to the door. He didn't unlock it. Instead, he looked out through the glass, watching as 3 dark-colored SUVs pulled up along the curb. The engines idled for a moment before shutting off. Then, one by one, the doors opened. Mason stepped out first. He looked different now. Less smug, more controlled. His usual arrogance was still there, but now it was laced with something colder. He wasn't here to make threats anymore. He was here to finish something. Behind him, a handful of men followed. They weren't the usual punks he ran with. These men moved differently. They were disciplined, deliberate, professionals. That was the part that made Henry's stomach turn. Mason took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the darkened cafe. He wasn't in a hurry. He wanted Henry to feel the weight of what was coming. Inside, Jason exchanged a glance with Carter. They saw what Henry saw. This wasn't just a shakedown anymore. This was something bigger. Mason finally stopped just outside the door, his hands resting casually in his jacket pockets. Then he leaned forward slightly, peering through the glass. He smirked when he saw Henry standing there. He knew Henry wouldn't run. That wasn't who he was. He tapped lightly against the door, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Then, without breaking eye contact, he mouthed 2 words. "Open up." Henry didn't move, didn't blink. Jason stepped beside him, his voice low. "He's pushing. He wants you to break first." Henry exhaled through his nose. He wasn't going to give Mason that satisfaction. Mason chuckled, shaking his head as he took a step back. He turned to one of his men, nodding slightly. That's when the first SUV's headlights flashed once. A signal. Inside, Jason stiffened. They're not just here to talk. Carter's jaw tightened. They're testing us. Henry looked at the men around him. He had only known them for a short time, but right now, they felt like the only people he could trust. He wasn't alone in this. Outside, Mason rocked back on his heels, waiting. Ryan, still hiding down the block, watched everything unfold with his heart pounding. He had been right. Mason hadn't let this go. But what terrified him the most wasn't Mason. It was the men standing beside him. Ryan recognized them, and he knew exactly what they were capable of. He took a shaky breath, knowing he had to make a choice. He could walk away, pretend he never saw any of this, or he could do something. He turned, disappearing into the darkness, making a decision he wasn't sure he would survive. Ryan moved quickly through the darkened streets, his heart pounding. Every instinct told him to get as far away as possible, but something inside him wouldn't let him leave. He had spent years trying to escape Mason's world, trying to rebuild a life that didn't revolve around fear. But now, standing in the shadows of his past, he realized he was still part of it, whether he liked it or not. Back at the cafe, Mason had grown tired of waiting. He turned slightly, giving another subtle nod to one of his men. The response was immediate. One of the SUV's back doors swung open, and a new figure stepped out. The air seemed to shift around him. He wasn't like Mason's usual muscle, There was something more controlled about him, something calculated. His suit was crisp, his stance too steady for a common street enforcer. The man didn't look like he belonged in a small-town power play, which made his presence all the more unsettling. Henry, still standing behind the locked cafe door, felt it too. His gut twisted. This wasn't just about his shop anymore. Mason had called in something bigger. Jason and Carter exchanged a glance, reading the situation without a word. This was no longer just a matter of running off a few thugs. Whoever this man was, he carried a different kind of authority. The man in the suit stepped forward, eyeing the cafe with quiet interest before turning to Mason. "Is this the place?" he asked, his voice calm, almost indifferent. Mason nodded, his earlier bravado dimmed slightly in the presence of this new player. "Yeah," he said, clearing his throat. "The old man's been a problem. Thought he had some backup tonight, but it's nothing we can't handle." The man in the suit didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a slow step toward the door, peering inside. His eyes settled on Henry, then moved over to Jason and the others. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then he smiled. "Interesting," he murmured. Henry didn't like the way the man was looking at them. He had dealt with plenty of tough guys before, men who relied on intimidation to get what they wanted. But this was something else. This man wasn't here to threaten. He was here to make a decision. Jason took a quiet breath, shifting slightly, putting himself between Henry and the door. His years of training told him everything he needed to know. This man wasn't just some mid-level criminal. He had the presence of someone who had seen things, done things. And that made him dangerous. "I assume you're the owner," the man finally said, looking at Henry. Henry didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if answering would change anything, but he also wasn't about to back down now. "That's right," he said evenly. The man nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble tonight." Henry exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. "I didn't start this." The man tilted his head slightly. "No," he said, "but you refused to end it when given the chance." Mason stepped forward again, clearly emboldened by the conversation. "We can handle this right now," he said, his voice tight with impatience. "He's got nothing." The man in the suit gave Mason a look, brief but enough to make him take a step back. Then, slowly, he turned back toward Henry. "You're lucky," he said simply. "I don't waste resources on small problems." He glanced at Mason, his expression unreadable. "Clean this up. Quietly." With that, he turned and walked back toward the SUV, leaving Mason standing there, caught between frustration and uncertainty. Inside the cafe, Jason's fingers twitched slightly, a muscle in his jaw tightening. He had seen power plays like this before, back in places where the rules were written in blood instead of laws. He didn't like where this was heading. Mason, still standing outside, clenched his jaw, clearly humiliated. He had wanted a show of force, but instead he had been dismissed. That only made him angrier. With a sharp nod, he turned to his men. "We're not leaving until this is finished." Inside, Henry took a slow breath. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Ryan, still watching from a distance, felt a deep chill settle in his bones. He had recognized the man in the suit, and that meant Henry was in far more danger than he realized. There was only one option left. Ryan turned and ran toward the only place he could think of, the sheriff's office. Ryan's breath came in short gasps as he sprinted through the empty streets. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by the knowledge of what he had just witnessed. The man in the suit wasn't just some criminal associate. He was someone Ryan had only heard about in whispers. A fixer. A man who cleaned up problems for people with real power. And now, Henry's cafe had become one of those problems. Inside the cafe, Henry stood firm, his grip tightening around the counter. He had faced trouble before, but this was different. Mason's usual arrogance had been replaced by cold determination. The presence of the fixer had shifted everything, and now Mason was more dangerous than ever. Jason's voice was low but steady. They're waiting for an opportunity. We can't give them one. Carter nodded. If they try to come inside, we make it clear that's not an option. Henry exhaled. He wasn't a fighter. He had spent his life running a place where people could feel safe, where a hot meal and a familiar face were always waiting. But now, his cafe had become a battleground. Outside, Mason stepped forward again, his fists clenched. He hated feeling powerless, and he wasn't about to let Henry walk away from this unscathed. "Open the door," he called out. "Let's talk." Jason glanced at Henry, who gave the slightest shake of his head. "No way." Mason smirked, expecting that response. He turned to his men. "Get ready." Before anything could happen, the sound of screeching tires cut through the night. A patrol car came into view, its lights flashing, but the siren remained off. The door swung open before it had even fully stopped, and Sheriff Dan Holloway stepped out, his boots heavy against the pavement. Ryan wasn't far behind, his chest still heaving from the sprint. "They're planning something," he said quickly. "You need to stop this before it gets worse." The sheriff took in the scene. Mason, the SUVs, the silent but undeniable tension. His gaze settled on the cafe, on Henry standing behind the glass. He had known Henry for years, had come here for coffee more times than he could count. And now the place felt like it was one breath away from collapsing under the weight of something much bigger. Mason forced a grin. "Sheriff, I was just..." Dan held up a hand. "Save it." His voice was firm, the kind of tone that made it clear he wasn't in the mood for games. He turned to Henry. "You okay?" Henry gave a slight nod. "For now." The sheriff studied the situation, then looked at Mason. "Here's what's going to happen. You and your friends are going to get in your cars and leave. Right now." Mason scoffed, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "I don't think you understand." "I understand plenty," Dan interrupted. "I know who your new friend is, and I know you're too small time to be pulling strings like this. So I'm going to assume you're in over your head, and I'm giving you one chance to walk away." Mason's jaw tightened. He wanted to push back, to prove he wasn't scared. But the sheriff wasn't bluffing. The fixer had already dismissed him once tonight. If he failed again, it wouldn't just be Henry who paid the price. Mason would be the next problem that needed cleaning up. His fingers twitched at his side, but he forced himself to take a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered. Dan's expression didn't change. "It is tonight." Mason gave Henry one last look, then turned and walked back toward the SUVs. His men followed, reluctant but silent. Within moments, the vehicles were gone, their taillights disappearing into the distance. The sheriff waited until the street was empty before turning back to Henry. "You should close up for the night." Henry nodded, exhaustion settling into his bones. Jason and Carter exchanged glances but said nothing. The danger had passed, but the weight of what had almost happened lingered in the air. Ryan hesitated, then stepped closer. That man, the one in the suit, he wasn't just here for Mason, was he? Henry didn't answer right away. He had seen it in the fixer's eyes. Recognition. A calculated interest. Mason might have started this, but now something larger had taken notice. And that was a problem Henry wasn't sure he could outrun. Dan sighed, running a hand over his face. "I'll keep an eye on things. But you should be careful, Henry. People like that, they don't just walk away." Henry exhaled, nodding. He knew that all too well. The cafe was safe, for now. But as Henry locked the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of something. It was just the beginning. The cafe felt different after the night's events. The hum of the overhead lights seemed softer, the shadows stretching longer in the empty space. Henry stood behind the counter, wiping his hands on a dish towel, but there wasn't much left to clean. It wasn't just about tidying up. It was about grounding himself, making sense of what had happened. Jason and Carter sat at one of the booths, quiet but alert. Their bodies were relaxed, but their eyes weren't. They had spent too many years in high-pressure situations to let their guard down completely. The night might have ended without violence, But that didn't mean the threat was gone. Ryan shifted near the door, glancing outside as if expecting Mason to come roaring back at any moment. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Henry let out a slow breath. "I don't know." He wasn't used to saying that. He had spent years making decisions, running this place, knowing exactly what needed to be done. But tonight had been different. This wasn't just about standing up to local thugs. It was about something bigger. Jason leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Mason might be out of the picture for now, but the real problem isn't him. He glanced at Carter, who nodded in agreement. That fixer, whoever he is, took an interest. And that's not something you can just ignore. Henry knew they were right. He had seen it in the man's eyes, the way he had looked at the cafe, at him. It wasn't about money or territory. It was something else. Sheriff Holloway had left earlier, but before he did, he had given Henry a long look. "If anything else happens, call me," he had said. But Henry had the feeling that even the sheriff wasn't sure what kind of storm had just started. Ryan hesitated before speaking again. "I think I know who that guy was." All eyes turned to him. He swallowed hard. "I used to run with people who dealt with guys like him. They don't operate in the open. They don't make threats. They just decide what's useful and what isn't. If he looked at this place and saw something worth noticing, that means it's not over." Henry tightened his grip on the towel, then tossed it onto the counter. He had spent his life keeping his head down, working hard, doing things the right way. He had built something here, a place where people felt safe. And now, because he had refused to back down, someone with real power had taken an interest. Jason studied him for a moment. "You have two choices," he said. "You can act like none of this happened and hope they forget about you, or you can get ahead of it." Henry frowned. "And how do I do that?"